Before you judge her, you need to understand why she did it, because from the outside, it looked like arrogance, pride, maybe even cruelty. But for Seraphina Vale, it felt like the only way to prove she was still in control of her own life. Seraphina stood at the balcony of the grand hall, overlooking a room filled with people who had already decided her future for her. The chandeliers shimmered, laughter echoed, glasses clinked, but none of it reached her. Because tonight wasn't just another gathering. It was an announcement waiting to happen, one she had been avoiding for weeks. "You can't keep delaying this," her mother's voice came from behind her, calm but sharp, the kind of calm that didn't invite disagreement. Seraphina didn't turn. She didn't need to. She already knew the look on her mother's face, controlled, certain, decided. "I'm not delaying," Seraphina replied quietly, her eyes fixed on the distant city lights. "I'm thinking." A soft scoff. "You've had enough time to think. This isn't about feelings, Seraphina. It's about alignment, stability, reputation." There it was, the three words that had followed her all her life. Alignment, stability, reputation, not happiness, not choice, not love. Seraphina finally turned, slowly, meeting her mother's gaze. "And what if I don't want any of that?" For a moment, silence, not the comfortable kind, the kind that tightens the air. Her mother stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Then you're choosing to be reckless." Seraphina almost smiled at that. Almost, because reckless was exactly what she was starting to consider. Across the room, she could see him, the man they had chosen. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect background. Everything about him made sense, and that was the problem. There was nothing to question, nothing to discover, nothing that felt real. He was a decision, not a person. And suddenly the thought of standing beside him for the rest of her life didn't feel like security. It felt like a slow, quiet surrender. "You will announce your engagement tonight," her mother continued, firm now. "Everything is already arranged." Of course it was. It always was. Seraphina's fingers tightened slightly against the railing. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to feel it, that subtle resistance building inside her, that quiet voice that had been ignored too many times. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't push it away. Instead, she listened. "What if I choose someone else?" she said suddenly. Her mother blinked, just once. That was all it took to reveal something unexpected. Surprise. "There is no one else," she replied flatly. Seraphina's gaze drifted across the room again, past the polished guests, past the rehearsed smiles, past everything that felt predictable. And then she saw him. Not because he stood out, but because he didn't try to. He was near the edge of the hall, partially obscured, dressed simply compared to everyone else. No effort to impress, no attempt to belong. And yet, he didn't look uncomfortable. He looked observant, like he was watching something no one else noticed. Their eyes met. Just for a second, and in that second, something shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough for her to feel it. He didn't look away immediately. He didn't lower his gaze like most would. He simply held it, calm, unbothered, as if he didn't see her as something untouchable, as if she was just a person. That was new and dangerous. "Seraphina," her mother's voice pulled her back, sharper now. "Don't entertain foolish thoughts." But it was too late. The thought had already formed, clear, defiant, and for once, entirely hers. Seraphina stepped away from the balcony, slowly, deliberately. "You said this is about stability, reputation, alignment," she said, her voice calm in a way that felt unfamiliar even to her. "Then it shouldn't matter who I choose, as long as I choose." Her mother's expression hardened. "You're not serious." Seraphina didn't answer. Instead, she started walking, through the crowd, past curious glances, past whispered assumptions. Every step felt heavier than the last, but also strangely lighter, because for the first time, she wasn't walking towards something expected. She was walking towards something unknown, and that made every heartbeat louder. He noticed her before she reached him. Of course he did. His posture didn't change, his expression didn't shift, but his attention sharpened, focused, like he had been expecting something, just not this. She stopped in front of him, close enough now to see the details others would overlook, the quiet confidence, the stillness, the way he didn't rush to speak. "Do you belong here?" she asked, her tone neutral but edged with curiosity. A subtle question, but not an innocent one. He studied her for a moment before answering. "Does anyone?" The response was unexpected, not defensive, not impressed, just honest. And that made something in her chest tighten, not discomfort, something else, something unfamiliar. "What's your name?" she asked. "Adrian." No title, no explanation. Just a name. Like it was enough. Seraphina nodded slowly, as if confirming something only she understood. Around them, the room continued as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Because in that moment, she made her decision. Not out of love, not out of certainty, but out of something far more dangerous. Defiance. "Adrian," she said, her voice steady now. "Would you marry me?" For the first time, his expression shifted. Not shock, not confusion. Something deeper. Something unreadable. The noise in the room began to fade as the words settled into the space between them. Because this wasn't just a question, it was a disruption. A fracture in a future that had already been written, and neither of them could take it back. No one spoke at first, not because they didn't hear her, but because they weren't sure they had. The music continued, glasses still touched, conversations lingered, but something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like a crack spreading quietly through glass. Seraphina held his gaze, unwavering now, even though she could feel every eye in the room beginning to turn toward them. Adrian didn't answer immediately. He studied her, not with confusion, not with excitement, but with a kind of stillness that made the moment feel heavier than it already was. "That's not a question people ask lightly," he said finally, his voice calm, almost too calm for what was happening. Seraphina tilted her head slightly as if considering that. "Then it's a good thing I'm not asking lightly." A faint murmur rippled through the crowd. It was happening now. People were noticing. Her mother had already stepped forward from across the room, her composure intact, but her pace sharper than before. "Seraphina!" she called, her voice controlled but edged with warning. "This isn't the time for theatrics." Seraphina didn't look at her, not yet. Her attention stayed fixed on Adrian. "Well," she asked quietly, "you haven't answered." Another pause, longer this time. Adrian glanced past her briefly, taking in the room, the tension, the weight of what she was doing. Then his eyes returned to hers. "Why me?" It wasn't resistance. It wasn't curiosity either. It was something closer to precision, like he was measuring her answer before deciding anything else. Seraphina exhaled slowly. She could lie. She could dress it up in something poetic or convincing. But something about him made that feel unnecessary. "Because you don't look like you need anything from me," she said. "And right now, that's the only thing that feels real." That landed, not loudly, but clearly. Adrian's expression shifted again, just slightly. Enough to show he understood more than she expected. Behind her, her mother had reached them now. "This ends now," she said firmly, stepping between them. "You will not embarrass this family over some stranger." Seraphina finally turned, meeting her mother's gaze without hesitation. "You said I needed to choose," she replied. "I'm choosing." "This is not a choice," her mother snapped quietly. "This is a mistake." "Maybe," Seraphina said, her voice steady. "But at least it's mine." The words hung there, heavier than anything else said that night. Around them, the room had gone quieter now, not silent, but attentive, watching, waiting, judging. And then, something unexpected happened. Adrian stepped forward, not dramatically, not urgently, just enough to be seen clearly beside her. "If she's asking," he said, his tone even, "then I should answer." Her mother turned to him, her expression cold now. "And who exactly are you?" A small pause, just long enough to feel intentional. "Someone who understands the weight of a decision like this," Adrian replied. "Which is why I won't treat it like a joke." That wasn't the answer she wanted, and everyone could see it, but it was the only one that mattered. He looked back at Seraphina, held her gaze again, this time longer. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly. "And you don't know anything about me either," she replied just as softly. "That makes it even?" A faint shift in the air, not approval, not rejection, something else, something uncertain. Adrian let out a slow breath, not hesitation, consideration, and then he nodded. "All right." The word was simple, but the effect wasn't. It moved through the room like a shockwave, quiet but powerful. Seraphina didn't react immediately, not outwardly, but inside, something settled, not relief, not confidence, just finality. Because now, it wasn't just a thought, it wasn't just defiance, it was real. Her mother stepped back slightly as if recalculating. "You don't understand what you've just agreed to," she said, this time not just to Seraphina, but to him. Adrian didn't respond to her. His focus stayed on Seraphina. "When?" he asked. The question was simple, direct, uncomplicated, and somehow, that made everything feel even more serious. Seraphina hesitated for the first time, not because she didn't know, but because now she had to say it out loud. "Soon," she answered, "before anyone can change it." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, not doubt, not fear, recognition, like he understood exactly what she meant by that. Around them, the whispers had started again, louder now, more defined. People were choosing sides, forming opinions, deciding what this meant. But none of that reached her anymore, because for the first time, she wasn't making a decision based on them. She was making it in spite of them. And that made it feel different. As the tension continued to build, and the reality of what just happened settled in, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be a quiet story. And if you're still watching at this point, I want to ask you something. Would you have done the same thing or walked away? Just think about it for a second, because what comes next might change how you see this entire decision. By the next morning, the story had already spread, not just within the estate, not just among the guests who had witnessed it, but beyond that, through quiet calls, subtle messages, carefully worded conversations that carried more judgment than curiosity. Seraphina had expected resistance. She had expected anger. What she didn't expect was how quickly everything would move. "You've made your point," her mother said the moment she stepped into the sitting room, her tone measured but colder than before. "Now we fix this." Seraphina didn't sit. She remained standing, hands lightly clasped in front of her, her posture calm in a way that almost felt unnatural. "There's nothing to fix," she replied. Her mother studied her carefully, as if searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything she could use to dismantle what had already been set in motion. "You don't even know who he is," she said. "Exactly," Seraphina answered. "Which means this decision isn't influenced by anything you've already arranged." That wasn't the answer her mother wanted, and it showed. "This isn't independence," she said sharply. "This is recklessness disguised as control." Seraphina didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't have something to say, but because for once she didn't feel the need to defend herself. Because deep down, she knew something her mother didn't. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It had already gone too far for that. "Where is he?" her mother asked finally. Seraphina turned slightly toward the doorway. "He'll be here." As if on cue, footsteps echoed faintly from the hall, not rushed, not hesitant, measured. Adrian entered the room with the same quiet composure he had the night before, dressed simply, nothing about him trying to match the elegance of the space around him. And yet, he didn't look out of place. That was the first thing Seraphina noticed again. The second was that he didn't seem impressed. "You're early," she said, her voice softer now. "I prefer clarity over delay," he replied. Her mother's gaze shifted to him instantly, sharp and assessing. "Then let's be clear," she said. "This arrangement ends now." Adrian didn't react, not immediately. He simply looked at her, as if weighing the words before deciding if they deserved a response. "Is that your decision?" he asked calmly. "It's the only reasonable one," she replied. A brief silence followed, the kind that stretches just long enough to reveal who's actually in control of it. Adrian's attention shifted, not to her, but to Seraphina. "And yours?" he asked. That was the moment everything narrowed. The room, the tension, the pressure. It all came down to a single answer. Seraphina didn't hesitate this time. "It stands." Her mother exhaled sharply, frustration breaking through the control she had been holding on to. "You're willing to throw everything away for this?" Seraphina met her gaze. "No," she said quietly. "I'm choosing not to pretend anymore." That landed harder than anything else she had said, because it wasn't emotional, it wasn't reactive, it was honest. And honesty was something this entire situation had been avoiding. Adrian watched her carefully, not with admiration, not with surprise, but with something more deliberate, like he was beginning to understand the weight behind her decision. "Then we proceed," he said simply. Her mother let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You say that like you have any idea what you're stepping into." Adrian's expression didn't change. "I have an idea," he replied. "What I don't have is hesitation." That was the first time her mother paused without immediately responding, not because she agreed, but because she couldn't easily dismiss it. Seraphina felt it too, that subtle shift, that small crack in certainty. And for the first time since this began, she wondered something she hadn't allowed herself to before, not about her decision, but about him. Because nothing about his presence aligned with what everyone else assumed, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way he didn't react to pressure. It wasn't just confidence, it was something else, something she couldn't fully define yet. "There are conditions," her mother said finally, regaining her composure. "If this continues," Adrian nodded slightly. "There always are." "You will be vetted," she continued. "Your background, your connections, your intentions." A faint pause. "Of course," he said, too easily, too calmly. That should have reassured her. But instead, it did the opposite. Because most people in his position would hesitate, would react, would push back. He didn't. And that made Seraphina's curiosity deepen. "And if something doesn't align," her mother pressed. Adrian's gaze remained steady. "Then you'll have your answer." It wasn't defensive. It wasn't aggressive. It was confident, in a way that didn't need to prove itself. Another silence followed, heavier now, more complicated. Because for the first time, this wasn't just about Seraphina's defiance. It was about something unknown entering a space that had always been controlled. "This won't end the way you think," her mother said quietly. "It already hasn't," Seraphina replied. And that was the truth no one in that room could ignore anymore. Because whatever this was, it wasn't simple, it wasn't predictable, and it definitely wasn't under control. As Adrian turned slightly, preparing to leave, Seraphina spoke again. "Why did you say yes?" He stopped, not turning immediately. Just enough to acknowledge the question, a brief pause. Then, slowly, he looked back at her. "Because you didn't ask like someone who needed saving," he said. "You asked like someone who was done waiting." And just like that, he left, leaving behind more questions than answers. And for the first time since this began, Seraphina realized something she hadn't expected. This wasn't just a decision anymore, it was a risk, and she still didn't know what she had just stepped into.
You ever notice how the biggest decisions in life don't usually feel big in the moment? They feel quiet, almost subtle, like something small you can still walk away from if you really want to. And that's what makes them dangerous, because by the time you realize what you've stepped into, you're already in it. And now it's not just about the choice anymore. It's about everything that choice starts to reveal, about the people around you, the expectations you've been carrying, and the parts of yourself you've been ignoring just to keep things stable. And the truth is, most people don't choose what they actually want. They choose what makes sense, what feels safe, what keeps everything from falling apart. But every now and then, someone does the opposite. And when that happens, it doesn't just change their path. It exposes everything that was quietly holding them in place. So the real question isn't whether her decision was right or wrong. It's whether it was finally hers.
By midday, the estate no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place under quiet investigation. Conversation stopped when Seraphina entered a room, Staff moved with a kind of careful awareness, as if even their presence could be interpreted as taking sides. And everywhere she went, there was that same unspoken question hanging in the air. "What have you done?" She ignored it. Not because it didn't affect her, but because acknowledging it would mean slowing down. And slowing down would mean thinking, and thinking too much. Right now felt dangerous, because if she allowed herself to question this even slightly, she wasn't sure she'd keep going. She stepped into the west corridor, a quieter part of the estate, where the noise of speculation didn't reach as easily. That's where she found him. Adrian stood near one of the tall windows, looking out over the gardens, as if he had been there for a while, still, composed, like the chaos surrounding them hadn't touched him at all. "You seem comfortable," she said as she approached, her tone neutral but edged with curiosity. He didn't turn immediately. "Comfort isn't the right word," he replied. "I just don't react to things I expected." That made her pause. "You expected this?" she asked. Now he turned, meeting her gaze. "Not this exact situation," he said, "but resistance, scrutiny, that part was inevitable." Seraphina studied him more closely now. Not just his words, but the way he delivered them. There was no strain, no hesitation, no attempt to impress her, just clarity. And that made it harder to read him. "Most people in your position would be overwhelmed by now," she said. "Most people don't agree to something like this," he replied calmly. That was true, and yet, it didn't explain everything. A brief silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but not entirely easy either. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of everything you didn't know. "They're going to look into your life," she said finally. "Every detail." "I assume they would," he answered. "And that doesn't concern you?" she pressed. He held her gaze for a moment before responding. "Should it?" It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't defensive. It was a genuine question. And that unsettled her more than anything else. Because people with something to hide usually reacted. They prepared. They calculated. He didn't. "You're either very confident," she said slowly, "or very reckless." A faint shift in his expression. Not quite a smile. Or, "I understand the difference between what matters and what doesn't." That answer lingered, because it didn't sound like something someone without experience would say. It sounded like someone who had already navigated situations far more complex than this. And that thought stayed with her. "Why didn't you refuse?" she asked, changing direction slightly. "You had every reason to." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped slightly closer, not invading her space, but enough to shift the dynamic of the conversation. "Would you have accepted it?" he asked. She hesitated, not outwardly, but internally, just for a second, because the honest answer was no. "Then the outcome would have been the same," he said, "just delayed." That was frustratingly logical, and yet, it didn't fully satisfy her. "You're avoiding the question," she said. "No," he replied calmly. "I'm answering the part that matters." Another pause. He wasn't giving her everything, that much was clear now. Not in a deceptive way, but in a controlled one. Like, he chose exactly how much to reveal and when. And that made her more aware of him than she wanted to be. "You realize this doesn't stay simple," she said. "It won't just be questions. There will be pressure, expectations, situations you can't just observe from a distance." His gaze didn't waver. "I'm aware. And you're still here. So are you." That landed, because it shifted the focus back to her, back to the decision she made, back to the part she couldn't explain as easily as she pretended to. She looked away briefly toward the gardens beyond the window. "This wasn't supposed to go this far," she admitted quietly. "Most things don't," he said. There was no judgment in his voice, no assumption, just acknowledgement, and that made it harder to stay guarded. "Then why does it feel like you expected it to?" she asked, turning back to him. For the first time since they met, he didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he was choosing whether to give it. That silence stretched just long enough to shift something in the air between them. "Because decisions made under pressure rarely stop at the surface," he said finally. "They tend to reveal things people weren't planning to face." Her expression tightened slightly. "And what do you think this is revealing?" she asked. He looked at her. Really looked this time, not casually, not passively, but with intent. "That you're not as certain as you want everyone to believe," he said. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't confrontational, but it was direct and accurate. She held his gaze, not backing down, but not denying it either, because denying it would make it obvious. "And you?" she asked. "What is this revealing about you?" A brief pause, subtle, controlled. "That I'm exactly where I need to be," he said. That answer should have been reassuring, but it wasn't, because it raised a different question, one she hadn't considered before, not about why she chose him, but about why he stayed, because at this point, he had enough reason to walk away, enough pressure, enough uncertainty, enough risk, and yet, he didn't, which meant one of two things. Either he had nothing to lose, or he had something to gain, and Seraphina couldn't tell which one was more dangerous. As the silence settled again, heavier this time, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to admit yet. This situation wasn't just complicated anymore, it was shifting, and whatever direction it was moving in, she was no longer the only one influencing it. By evening, the pressure stopped pretending to be subtle. It showed up in direct conversations, in carefully worded warnings, in invitations that weren't really invitations. Seraphina was summoned to the private dining room, a space reserved for decisions that affected more than just one person. When she walked in, her father was already seated. That alone told her this was no longer just about disapproval. This was escalation. He didn't look angry. That would have been easier. He looked measured. The kind of calm that meant every word had already been chosen before she arrived. "Sit," he said. She did. Not out of obedience, but because standing would turn this into something else entirely. "I've been informed of your decision," he continued, folding his hands, "and I've taken the liberty of accelerating the necessary inquiries." Seraphina held his gaze. "That was expected." A faint nod. "Good. Then we can skip the obvious." A brief pause. "He doesn't exist the way he should." That landed harder than anything her mother had said all day. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the shift in her chest. "It means," her father said, "that for someone who claims so little, there should still be something. Records, history, a pattern." He leaned forward slightly. "There isn't. Silence, not empty, tight, controlled." "That doesn't prove anything," she replied. "It proves enough to proceed carefully," he said, "and to set conditions." Of course, there were always conditions. "You will host a dinner tomorrow evening," he continued. "Small, select. People who know how to ask the right questions without appearing to." Seraphina understood immediately. This wasn't a dinner, it was a test. "And if he fails?" she asked. Her father's expression didn't change. "Then this ends, quietly." The word quietly carried more weight than it should have, because nothing about this would be quiet if it broke publicly. She nodded once, not agreement, acknowledgement. Understood. When she left the room, the air felt heavier than before, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Because now there was a direction, and it wasn't hers anymore. She found Adrian where she expected him, back near the windows, as if the open space gave him a better view of everything unfolding. "They're testing you," she said without preamble. He turned slightly, not surprised. "I assumed they would." "Tomorrow," she added. "Dinner. It won't be obvious, but it won't be simple either." A small pause. "And if I don't meet their expectations?" he asked. She hesitated. Not long, just enough to feel it. "Then they'll end this?" He nodded once, absorbing that without reaction. "All right." That was it. No resistance, no concern, just acceptance. And that bothered her more than if he had argued. "You're not even curious about what they found?" she asked. His gaze settled on her. "Are you?" The question caught her off guard, because she hadn't asked. Not directly, not yet. "They said there's nothing," she admitted. "No real background, no clear history." "And what do you think that means?" he asked. She searched his expression, looking for something to anchor her answer to. But there was nothing obvious to read. "It means you're either exactly what you appear to be, she said slowly. Or not at all. A faint shift in his eyes. Not amusement, not tension. Something more controlled. Both can be true, he said. That didn't help. If anything, it made things more complicated. You could stop this, she said suddenly. Walk away before it turns into something neither of us can control. A brief silence followed. Then, quietly, would you? She didn't answer, because she already knew she wouldn't. And so did he. Then we continue, he said. Simple, final, the kind of answer that closed the door on hesitation. The next evening arrived faster than she expected. The dining room was prepared with precision, every detail intentional, every seat chosen carefully. These weren't just guests, they were observers. People who could dismantle a person's story with a few well-placed questions. When Adrian entered, nothing about him had changed. Same composure, same quiet presence. But now, every movement was being measured. Every word would matter. Seraphina watched closely, not from across the room, but from within it, close enough to catch the subtle things. The way he greeted each guest without overcompensating. The way he listened more than he spoke. The way he never rushed to fill silence. It wasn't performance, it was control. And slowly, the tone in the room began to shift. Not approval, not acceptance, but something close to uncertainty, because he wasn't giving them anything to use. You've traveled? One guest asked casually, swirling his glass. A little, Adrian replied. Where? A pause, not long, just enough to feel intentional. Places that teach you more by observing than by arriving. The answer was vague, but not weak. It redirected without refusing. Another guest leaned in slightly. And what do you do? I pay attention, he said. That drew a few quiet reactions. Subtle, controlled, but noticeable. Because it wasn't what they expected. Seraphina felt it then. That shift again. The same one from before. The one that made everything harder to define. This wasn't someone being exposed. This was someone managing the exposure. And that realization changed something in her. Because now, it wasn't just about whether he would pass their test. It was about whether they even understood what they were testing. As the evening continued, the questions became sharper, more direct, more intentional. But every time, he adjusted. Not defensively, not aggressively. Just enough to stay ahead of the assumption behind the question. And by the time dessert was served, the room had gone quieter than expected. Not because they were satisfied, but because they weren't. Because they hadn't found what they were looking for. And that made him more dangerous than if they had. As the guests began to leave, one of them paused beside her father. Interesting choice, he said quietly. Not what we expected. Her father didn't respond immediately. He simply watched Adrian from across the room, his expression unreadable. No, he said finally, it isn't. And for the first time since this began, Seraphina realized something she hadn't fully allowed herself to consider. This wasn't just a risk anymore. It was a situation that was starting to turn, and she still didn't know in whose favor. By the time the last guest left, the silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like aftermath. The kind that settles in after something important has shifted, even if no one has said it out loud yet. Seraphina remained standing near the edge of the room, watching the door long after it closed, as if expecting something else to follow. Footsteps, a call, a correction. Nothing came. They didn't get what they wanted, Adrian said from behind her, his voice calm, unchanged. She didn't turn immediately. No, she replied quietly. They didn't. A pause, then she added, That's not the same as approval. It rarely is, he said. She finally faced him, studying him more openly now. Not cautiously, not defensively, just directly. You handled that too well, she said. That's not a compliment. A faint shift in his expression. I didn't take it as one. They pushed harder than I expected, she continued. And you never slipped. Neither did you, he replied. That caught her off guard. I wasn't the one being tested. You were, he said. Just not in the same way. Silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't uncertain. It was focused. What are you not telling me? she asked finally. No hesitation, no deflection. Just the question she should have asked earlier. Adrian didn't answer right away. He walked past her slightly, stopping near the long table where the remains of the evening still lingered. Half-empty glasses, untouched plates, the subtle evidence of observation. "There are things about me that don't align with what they expect," he said. "That much is obvious." "That's not an answer," she replied. He turned back to her. "It's the beginning of one." "That wasn't enough, not anymore." "You said yes too easily," she said, her voice tightening just slightly. "You stayed too calmly. You navigated tonight like you've done this before." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "So, I'm asking again, what are you not telling me?" For a moment, the room felt smaller, quieter, like everything outside of this conversation had been pushed away. Adrian held her gaze, steady as always, but something beneath that steadiness had shifted. Not uncertainty, not pressure, something closer to decision. "I wasn't supposed to be here," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. "Meaning?" she pressed. "Meaning," he continued, "this wasn't part of the plan." A pause, just long enough to let that settle. "What plan?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, as if measuring how much to say. Then, quietly, "The kind that requires you to stay unnoticed." That didn't clarify anything. If anything, it made it worse. "You're being vague on purpose," she said. "Yes," he replied. No apology, no hesitation, just the truth. That frustrated her more than anything else. "Do you understand what this looks like?" she asked. "To them? To me? Yes. And you're still choosing not to explain?" "For now." That answer hit differently. Not because it avoided the question, but because it acknowledged that there was something real behind it. Something being held back deliberately. She stepped away slightly, running her hand along the edge of the table, grounding herself in something physical, something certain. "This wasn't supposed to turn into this," she said quietly. "It already has," he replied. Another silence, heavier this time. Because now, it wasn't just about pressure or expectations. It was about trust, and trust required something he wasn't fully giving. "I need to know what I've stepped into," she said. "You will," he answered, "just not all at once." That wasn't reassuring. It wasn't even comfortable, but it was consistent, and that made it harder to dismiss. "That's not how this works," she said. "It is if the alternative puts you in a position you can't control." She looked at him sharply. "You don't get to decide that for me." "I'm not deciding it for you," he said calmly. "I'm delaying it." That difference mattered, more than she wanted to admit, because it implied something she hadn't considered fully. Not that he was hiding something dangerous, but that he believed revealing it too soon would be. For her. "You think you're protecting me?" she said. "I think timing matters," he corrected. "And right now, you're still deciding what this is." She held his gaze, searching for something definitive, something she could use to anchor herself, but all she found was the same controlled clarity he had shown from the beginning. No cracks, no obvious tells, just intention. "And what is this to you?" she asked. A brief pause, then quietly. "Not what it started as." That was the first answer that didn't feel measured. Not completely. It wasn't a full truth, but it wasn't empty either. And that made it more unsettling, because now she wasn't just dealing with uncertainty. She was dealing with something evolving, something neither of them had planned. "This doesn't stay contained," she said. "It won't," he agreed. "Then eventually, everything comes out." "Eventually," he said again. The word lingered, because eventually could mean anything. Tomorrow, a week, too late. As the silence settled once more, Seraphina felt something shift inside her. Not doubt, not regret. Something more complicated. Because for the first time since this began, she wasn't just questioning the decision, she was questioning the direction. Not whether it was right or wrong, but whether she was still the one leading it. And as she looked at Adrian, standing there with that same quiet certainty, she realized something she hadn't expected to feel. This wasn't just a risk anymore. It was something she didn't fully understand. And the most unsettling part wasn't that he had secrets. It was that part of her was willing to wait to find out what they were. By morning, the estate felt different again, but not quieter, not calmer, just more certain, like something had been decided beneath the surface and everything else was now adjusting around it. Seraphina stood by the tall window in her room, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, her reflection faint beside it. For the first time since all of this began, she wasn't trying to predict what would happen next. She was simply present. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," she said, her voice steady. The door opened and Adrian stepped inside. No hesitation, no announcement. Just that same controlled presence that had followed him from the very beginning. "You're early," she said. "There's something you should know," he replied. The tone was different this time, not guarded, but resolved. She turned fully toward him. "Then don't hold back." A brief pause, not uncertainty. "Wait." "Your father's inquiry didn't just reach empty records," he said. "It reached people who weren't meant to be contacted." Seraphina didn't move, but something in her expression shifted. Meaning, whatever distance existed between my life and yours is gone now, he said. Silence settled in the room, sharp and focused. "You knew this could happen," she said. "Yes." "And you stayed anyway?" "Yes." There was no apology in it, no attempt to soften it, just truth. And somehow that made it heavier. "Why?" she asked quietly. Adrian held her gaze, and for once there was no calculation behind it. "Because leaving would have been easier," he said. "And I wasn't interested in easy." That answer didn't explain everything, but it explained enough. "You're still not telling me everything?" she said. "No," he replied. "I'm not." She exhaled slowly, letting that settle instead of fighting it. "Then answer this," she said. "Is there anything about this that puts me at risk?" A short pause. "Not if I handle it correctly." "And if you don't?" His eyes didn't waver. "Then I make sure it never reaches you." That should have unsettled her more than it did. But at this point, she understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't about certainty anymore. It was about choice. "This started as defiance," she said, her voice softer now. "A way to prove I wasn't going to live the life that was already written for me." She looked at him fully. "It's not that anymore." "What is it?" he asked. "Something I'm choosing, without knowing how it ends." The words hung there, quiet but undeniable. Adrian studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Then you deserve to know what you're stepping into." This was the moment, the one where everything could shift from uncertainty to truth. Seraphina didn't hesitate. "Then tell me." A long silence followed, not empty, but deliberate. And then he spoke. "I wasn't trying to disappear," he said. "I was stepping away from a life that was already decided for me." Her breath slowed slightly. "What kind of life?" "The kind where every move is watched, every decision has consequences beyond you, where who you are matters less than what you represent," he said. That sounded too familiar. "That doesn't explain the missing history," she said. "It does if the history was never meant to be visible," he replied. And just like that, everything shifted. This wasn't a man with nothing. This was a man who had everything, and chose to leave it behind. "So, this wasn't random," she said. "You chose this." "Yes." "And I changed that." "Yes." No hesitation, no denial, just truth again. She let that settle. Really settle this time, because now she understood the weight of it. This wasn't just her stepping into something unknown. It was her pulling something hidden into the light, and that meant consequences, real ones. "You should walk away," he said then, calm, certain. "Before this becomes something you can't control." She looked at him carefully, searching for any sign that he expected her to agree. There wasn't one. He wasn't asking, he was giving her a choice, a real one. "If I walk away," she said slowly, "everything goes back to how it was supposed to be. Yes, predictable, controlled, safe. Yes." She held his gaze. "And if I don't?" A brief pause. "Then it becomes something else," he said. "Something uncertain." "Something real," she said quietly. That time, he didn't correct her. He didn't respond at all, because he didn't need to. The truth was already there, clear enough. Seraphina took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to decide. And when she spoke again, there was no hesitation left. "Then I'm not walking away." Silence followed, but not the heavy kind, not the uncertain kind, just the kind that comes when something has finally settled into place. Adrian watched her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Then we move forward," he said. Simple, final, but different now. Because now they both understood what that meant. Not just risk, not just uncertainty, but consequence. Real consequence. She turned back toward the window, the city stretching out in front of her, unchanged and yet completely different, because she wasn't standing in the same place anymore, and she wasn't choosing the same life. Behind her, Adrian moved toward the door, quiet as always. But just before he left, he paused. "One thing," he said. She didn't turn. "What?" A brief silence. "This doesn't end quickly." A faint, almost unnoticeable smile touched her expression. "Good," she said softly. "I'm not looking for quick." The door closed behind him, and the room fell still again. But this time, the silence didn't feel uncertain. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. And maybe that's what makes moments like this matter. Not the certainty, not the outcome, but the decision to move forward anyway. So, if you've made it this far, I want you to think about this for a second. Would you have walked away or stayed and faced the unknown? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the choices we hesitate on the most are the ones that define everything that comes after.
If you've made it this far, then you probably realized this story was never just about power, secrets, or manipulation. It was about control. And what happens when someone finally meets a person they cannot easily control. Seraphina Vale spent her entire life mastering rooms before she even stepped into them. Every expression, every silence, every glance was calculated. People feared her confidence, admired her intelligence, and underestimated how much pain it takes to become emotionally untouchable. But what makes her truly powerful is not her wealth, her beauty, or even her influence. It's her discipline. Even when the truth started breaking apart the world around her, she never collapsed emotionally in front of anyone. That level of composure is rare. Most people panic when control disappears. She adapted, quietly, strategically, and that is strength. The second thing that makes Seraphina dangerous is her awareness. Throughout the story, she was constantly observing. While others react emotionally, she studies patterns, motives, hesitation, and silence. She understands that people reveal themselves most when they think they are hiding something. That ability to read tension before words are spoken is why she survived every shift in power during the night. She wasn't simply intelligent, she was emotionally aware in a way most people never become. And in real life, that matters more than brute force. The people who understand human behavior often control outcomes long before others realize a game is even being played. But the third strength, the one most people will miss, is the hardest one of all. Seraphina had the strength to face truth directly. Even when the truth threatened her identity, her control, and everything she believed, she still walked toward it. That corridor was symbolic. The deeper she walked into the darkness, the closer she came to confronting reality without illusion. Most people avoid uncomfortable truths. Most people run from revelations that could change them forever. She didn't. She moved forward anyway, calmly, and that may have been the most powerful thing she did in the entire story. Adrian understood something important about her from the very beginning. Strength is not loud. Real strength is quiet. It's restraint. It's patience. It's the ability to remain composed while the world around you changes shape. And by the end of the story, neither of them truly won. What changed was understanding. They saw each other clearly for the first time, and sometimes that is more dangerous than conflict itself. So ask yourself this: if you were forced to confront the truth about your own life, your own masks, your own fears, would you walk away from it? Or would you keep walking deeper into the corridor like Seraphina did? If this story pulled you in, then you already belong here. Welcome to Duke's Courtyard, where power, psychology, mystery, and human nature collide in cinematic storytelling. Subscribe to Duke's Courtyard for more stories that challenge perception, expose hidden truths, and leave you thinking long after the final scene fades to black. And before you go, tell me in the comments, who truly had the power in this story, Seraphina or Adrian?